Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for coming and thanks for the invitation. I've enjoyed the conversations I've had already and I'm looking forward to some this afternoon. So I'm going to talk today on the tropical expansion in the southern hemisphere, so it's the Hadley circulation, etc. I'm not a tropical I'm not a meteorologist, and I'm certainly not a tropical meteorologist, and I've got interested in this property because of my interest in the ozone hole and its potential impact on the tropospheric climate. So it was a kind of roundabout way. I should mention my collaborators. I've done a lot of this work with Lorenzo Polvani from Colombia, not too far away from here, who's like me, is not a meteorologist. Chaim Garfinkel was a postdoc. He's now faculty in Israel, and some other collaborators I'll mention along the way. So the introduction is, this is a kind of schematic. I'm assuming you've all seen versions of this. So we have that in the kind of zonal mean perspective, we have these tropospheric kind of Hadley circulations, which end up with this downwelling resulting in subtropical high pressures and the kind of dry desert regions in the subtropics. And so there's a connection between this kind of zonal circulation and the surface hydrology. And just looking at this kind of simple picture, you would think that, and would realize that if something happened that this tropical region was, say, expanding, or you moved where this downwelling region in and where these dry zones are, that could have a large societal impact. So there's a lot of people who live in these regions where already water issues, water supply or quality is an issue, so if there's any change in that, that would be of some concern. And so it turns out that there has been evidence over the last, I'd say, decade that, or more, that the width of the tropics has been expanding. Exactly what I mean by the width of the tropical circulation, I'll come to. I'll also show some evidence of why this has changed. And I guess an illustration of whether an issue is something that people are worrying about is whether you start getting conferences and whether you start having articles. And so there's been articles in, this was Nature Geoscience, one in Physics Today, and in Nature, I guess a year ago, had an article on this. So this is all about the so-called expanding of the tropics. And so there's a lot of interest in this from the meteorology perspective, and there's also the potential that it could have a large societal impact. So these titles are all very kind of the widening of the tropics and how it's the mystery of the expanding tropics. But when we start looking at the evidence, there's quite a few kind of uncertainties. So this is a figure that I think is based on something that appeared in one of the IPCC. This is showing various metrics versus time for the northern hemisphere and then southern hemisphere of the edge of the tropics. And if you stare at this enough, you can see that most of these curves, so in the northern hemisphere, say the blue and this brownish curve are moving, expanding, so the northern edge of the tropics is getting larger, and in the southern hemisphere they're expanding downward as well. However, it's crystal clear that there's a lot of variability in all these metrics. The different metrics are giving you a different mean position, and so there's a lot of uncertainty in the details. And in terms of the metrics, they vary from, you can't see this, but the blue is a measure of where the meridional stream function crosses zero. So you look at 500 hectopascals where the zero line is. So that this would be, say, a metric of the width of the Hadley cell. Let's see what other one. The blue, the brownish one, or orange, I guess, is a metric which is based on the OLR. So it's a metric that was defined on the region where the OLR was highest, saying this was going to be this subtropical dry region, and where that and how that was changing. The black curve is something based on stratospheric ozone. The green is the jet stream. So there's a lot of variations in here. So I would say the evidence is there that the tropics have been expanding, but if you ask the details about how much, what the variability is, you get a very different answer depending on which metric you use. And in some of these metrics, so I guess the data used for these metrics varies a lot as well. So some of them have had to come from reanalyses. Other ones, so ozone has come from measurements, direct measurements. The OLR was based on the satellite measurements. So there's different data sets that have come in there. But even if you take the same metric, so this is the stream function, the crossing, the latitude where the 500 hectopascals meridional stream function vanishes, and you look at these different reanalysis products, again, they all show a kind of expansion overall. This is southern hemisphere edge, northern hemisphere edge, but the mean position and the rate of expansion varies dramatically between these different data sets. I think this is one take-home message is this, is you should be thinking very carefully before you use reanalyses to look at trends. And then especially when it's something like the meridional, derived quantity. So you should be careful doing this, but it doesn't stop people doing it. So anyhow, so this is just one level of the uncertainty. So we have the fact that the evidence of the tropics is expanding. The details differ between the metrics and the data set you use. Another issue is that when you compare it to models, the models do show, if you run the models with increasing greenhouse gases, the models do show an expansion, but this is a plot here showing the models, the multi-model mean are down here, and these are the various reanalyses. This is for the total, and this is Southern Hemisphere and DGF. So there's uncertainty in the reanalyses, but they're all up here, say around 1 degree per decade, a little bit lower down here. The models are down maybe around kind of 0.1 or 0.2. So the models are underestimating the observed trends. So I think there's several large-scale questions. One is, why is there such a large range in these expansion rates? If we're going to, why are different metrics? Is it because of different metrics or because of different data sets? We're using reanalyses, so there's a lot of questions there. A second is, what's the cause? And you'll be able to find lots of papers that draw conclusions to the cause. Unfortunately, those conclusions don't always agree. And so we need to know why there's a range of values and why it's different. And then why do the models underestimate this? Is this because the models are missing a key process? Or is this because the data is uncertain? Or is it because the comparisons have been done kind of incorrectly? So I'm going to, the outline, I'm going to try and summarize 3 kind of studies that I've been involved with, not in the order that we did them, but in order of answering these questions. So the first is and most of these are going to be model-based. The first is this issue of these different metrics. And so there's lots of comparisons out there. The IPCC shows a comparison. There's probably like 6 different papers already that are comparing different kind of calculations of expansion rates. But most of them have compared different people's applying different metrics to different data sets. And so you see differences, and it's not clear whether it's because the metrics are different or because the data sets are different. So the first part, we took some model output from runs that were very long runs, so we had lots of data, and we just looked to see whether the metrics are measuring, which metrics are measuring the same aspects, or which metrics co-vary in a model where it's physically consistent. Then I'm going to move to looking at this issue of what causes the expansion of the southern hemisphere, and this is driven by trying to reconcile different papers that were giving different conclusions. So this is actually more a meta-analysis than me actually doing any new calculations or analysis. And then finally, we're going to look at using some models to the role of internal atmospheric variability. And I'm going to focus on the southern hemisphere in the summertime because of the bias of coming from, partly because of the bias of coming from stratospheric ozone depletion. This is the season when it has the largest impact. It's also the season when in the southern hemisphere there is the strongest trends. And the northern hemisphere is just as important, but if we can't understand the simpler southern hemisphere, it's going to be hard to understand the northern hemisphere. And just to give the conclusions now of these, so this is, I'm going to show that all metrics aren't measuring the same thing, and so a large region, some of the differences are because we're comparing apples and oranges. There are some of them that are similar, and so I'm going to focus on these. This is going to, part of the solution of cause of this expansion is ozone depletion is playing a dominant role, but it's not the only role. SSTs, but more importantly, internal atmospheric variability. And so part of the reason that models, I think, are underestimating the trend is the comparison has been of the multi-model mean, which gives you the forced response, with observations, which are forcing plus natural variability. So again, some of the discrepancies are not doing a kind of fair comparison. Okay. Let me go into the first part. So we were trying to answer, whether these metrics were all the same or, what were they measuring? And so we wanted to answer, do different metrics, how are they related? Do they vary the same seasonally, interannually? And do they capture the same kind of variations in the Hadley Cell or the tropical circulation? And so the approach we did is we took 7 different metrics that had been used previously, and we calculated these from the Community Earth System model. So this is the NCAR climate model, and they've done a large ensemble runs. And so for this, they took their climate model, they ran it for 2,000 years under pre-industrial conditions, and then they did, with this stage, they've done 40 runs from 1920 to 2080 using historical forcing, and then I think it was RCP 4.5. And so they've done this 40 times. So we've got some idea from these runs of what the natural variability is and also the forced response. And so there's plenty of, we can do statistics here to sort this out. And again, we're not saying that the model is perfect or is getting the observed response, but what we can say that all these fields are dynamically consistent. And so any difference between these metrics is due to the metrics themselves, not the inconsistency of the data sets. Okay, so just to run down the metrics that were used. So, I don't know if you can see this. So this plot here, so DJF, the coloring here is showing the meridional stream function. So the one diagnostic, the psi, is where at 500 it changes from blue to red. So that is kind of traditionally the metric for the zonal mean Hadley Cell. Another metric is where the P minus E equals 0. Then there's these 3 different L's, which are the latitude of the subtropical, barotropic, or surface jet. So they use the wind speed to pick out where the location of these are. There's one based on the tropopause, temperature, and another one based on OLR. Okay. So these are the 7 metrics that other people have used, and we've just applied the same kind of definition to this data set. And if you look at this, first of all, you can roughly kind of divide them into upper atmosphere and lower atmosphere metrics. There's a bit, the nomenclature is not perfect, but we've got OLR, the tropopause temperature, and the subtropical kind of jet. We're going to call those upper atmosphere metrics. I should say, for someone who's worked a lot of time in the stratosphere, calling the troposphere the upper atmosphere is still difficult. And then there's going to be the lower atmosphere, which is the psi, these jets, and the P minus E. Now, one thing that you can already see from this is just the mean state, is that the upper atmosphere metrics are all at roughly the same location as the Psi 500, but the lower atmosphere metrics, their mean location varies. I think part of this connection here is that some of these metrics you need to define a kind of threshold, or come up with a criteria. And I think the people have come up with criteria so they come up with an answer that on the mean agrees with the psi equals 500. Whereas these metrics like P minus E, that's just surface precipitation, so you define it based on where that changes, and these are the other kind of jets. Okay, so let's look at these. First of all, we'll look at the climatology. So this is showing month and the latitude for the different metrics. The black curve, if you can see it, is the psi equals 500. And then you can see the blue are all these upper atmosphere metrics, and as I commented, they're all at basically the same mean latitude, and they have a similar seasonal cycle. So if you base your criteria on the climatology, you would say all these metrics are measuring a similar thing. The P minus E is further poleward, but has the same seasonal cycle. The barotropic and the low-level jets are even further poleward, and their seasonal cycle is different. Okay. So this is already telling you there's some similarities and differences, but we're more worried about the kind of interannual variability and long-term trends. So what Ari Solomon did was calculate the correlation, the interannual correlation. So we've got, I think it was 2000, between 1,000 and 2,000 years, and for each month he calculated the correlation between each of the fields, and in this case with the psi equals 500. And so this plot here is showing for each month from November through to October, the bottom row is the correlation of P minus E with psi 500, and this correlation is positive and it's pretty high. So there's a significant correlation for all months, largest in the summer and spring, for P minus E and psi equals 500. And there's a similar correlation for the other lower atmosphere metrics. So we would argue that all these metrics in the psi 500 have the same interannual variability. And so the process that's causing one of them to vary interannually is probably causing the other metrics to vary. But when we look at the tropopause metric, or the OLR, or the subtropical jet, there's basically no correlation, and if you start to get a correlation, it's actually negatively correlated. So this would indicate that these metrics are not measuring the same thing as these. Okay? Well, at least they don't co-vary with the psi equals 500. You can flip around and say, let's take P minus E. You might argue, I would say quite realistically, that P minus E is the metric you really care about, the surface precipitation, and you get basically the same result, that the psi or these lower atmosphere jets are reasonably well correlated, the upper metrics aren't. This is just for the long runs. You can go and look at, this is just repeating those two figures. This is now using the decadal variability for the pre-industrial run, or this is the ensemble mean between these past runs, the 40 ensemble runs. And so you can't tell the details, but the same thing on interannual and decadal scale variability. The lower atmosphere metrics are telling you are co-varying, the upper atmosphere metrics aren't. Okay. And this is, the correlation between psi and P minus E has been noted before. The reanalyses are a bit more spotty. You can't, but shorter data record, more uncertainty. But you see a similar kind of plot that the P minus E and psi are well correlated. The barotropic jet is as well, but the tropopause and the subtropical jet aren't. Okay. And then you can even go and look at trends, and you'd pick out the same trends. This is from pre-industrial 2000. We've got 40 runs, so we can calculate statistics. So the psi, P minus E, the barotropic jet, there's differences in details, but they're all showing, in this model, a trend of around 1 degree. The OLR or the tropopause are showing inconsistent kind of trends. So given these modeling results, it's perhaps not surprising that you're getting, back to one of the earlier plots I showed, that you get different results depending on these different metrics, because some of them are measuring different aspects. Okay, so I guess the take home for me is that if we're using psi 500 or P minus E, then we've got a reasonable kind of metric of the Hadley cell or surface dryness. But if you're using these metrics, they're measuring something else. Okay, and so the fact that there's trends in these are interesting, and that needs to be understood, but we shouldn't be comparing trends in OLR with trends in psi equals 500 and thinking that we're saying something about the Hadley cell directly. Okay, that was part one. Now, what actually kind of got me into this was looking at the cause of the southern hemisphere expansion. And so there have been previous modeling studies and observational studies trying to understand this, and there had been quite a few studies that had done single forcing or isolated forcing runs. So you'd take a climate model or a GCM and would run it with, say, all things changing, and then they'd run it again with, say, just stratospheric ozone changing, or just greenhouse gases changing, or just SSTs changing. And some of the studies listed here concluded that stratospheric ozone depletion was responsible for the majority of the shift. And they used words like largely attributed to, caused by, predominantly a response to. But then there was another set of studies that had done what appeared like the same type of experiments, and they concluded that the warming SSTs was the main driver or principal mechanism or can account for it. And so I was actually involved with an ozone assessment. So just like the IPCC does an assessment of the climate change, because of the Montreal Protocol, there's a group that does, it's actually every 4 years, an assessment of our understanding of stratospheric ozone and then its impact on climate. And so the people charged with writing this chapter were having arguments because we had been read different papers and had different conclusions. So the approach that I took was to do a meta-analysis. I didn't set out to do this. I just happened to do this for my own benefit because the conclusions or the abstracts of these papers were contradictory. And so what I did is I found all these studies that had done single forcing, so runs where they'd isolated one forcing and calculated the expansion of the Hadley cell. And it turns out there were several who had done with all forcings changing. I'm going to call it all forcing. And they'd also looked at runs with either just the SSTs or maybe SSTs and greenhouse gases only changed. And I'm only focusing on one metric because this was the only common metric that they'd all done. And this was published a couple of years ago. So this is a table. I know I hate showing tables in papers, let alone in talks. So the details are here. You can't read it, or I don't want you to read all of them. I'm just going to comment that, yes, there were 7 studies that had done single forcing runs of the southern hemisphere expansion, but they weren't. They varied between whether they were a coupled run or whether there was prescribed SSTs. They varied between whether stratospheric ozone was prescribed or whether there was interactive chemistry. Several of them were single model studies, but a couple were multi-model. So they took the CMIP5 or 3 archive. They looked at different periods. Some of them were transient. Some of them were time slice, where you fix your conditions at, say, 1960, run for 100 years, change into 2000, run for 100 years. And so I guess as soon as you identify this, it's probably not surprising that you're getting different results. So there is a lot of apples and oranges comparisons in here. But I tried to kind of make sense, and so I estimated or calculated the shift in degrees per decade for each of these studies for when they had all the forcings in there. And so to do this, I've had to do some of these runs did 1960 time slice and 2000 time slice, and so you take a difference. Some of the other ones had a transient, so this was based on a trend. And so they're not perfectly comparisons, but they all show trends of around 0.2 degrees per decade with quite a bit of uncertainty, but none of this uncertainty doesn't cross the zero line. So you'd argue they all say there's a significant, statistically significant trend when they have all the forcings. So they agree with that. When you compare this with the reanalysis trends, you get the same result I mentioned before. The reanalysis are up here and the models are down here. So they all underestimate the observed forcing. I'm going to come back to that. But let's forget the observations at the start. I'm a modeler, so they just complicate matters. And stick with model land. Now the red dots here are showing the same studies, the same quantity, except now calculated in runs where the only change was either the SSTs or the SSTs in greenhouse gases. If it was a GCM with prescribed SSTs, they just prescribed the SSTs. If it was a couple model, they changed the CO2 and SSTs changed as a response. So now you see a more mixed, that most of the studies, so in all the studies there is a trend when you just have SSTs changing, but for most of them it's not statistically significant. The lines here, which are the uncertainty, cross zero. The one exception is this study here, which I'll come back to, which showed SSTs being totally responsible. So from this, the kind of conclusion that I would kind of draw is that yes, SSTs are playing a role, but in most of these studies it's not the dominant role. It's not that it doesn't play any role, but for most of them you can't distinguish it statistically. Okay. Now that leaves the conclusion of what else would be causing this change. And so one of the hypotheses is that it was stratospheric ozone. So just a couple of asides on that. So I'm imagining that most of you haven't thought much about stratospheric ozone depletion or its impact on the troposphere. This is a cartoon. So over the last few decades, there's been significant depletion of stratospheric ozone over Antarctica in September through November due to increased CFCs. So in the stratosphere, ozone, we worry about ozone in the stratosphere because it absorbs UV radiation. So it's our shield because of that. But also because it absorbs that UV radiation, it warms the stratosphere. And so if you remove some of the ozone, or a lot of the ozone, then you're removing a warming mechanism and you get a significant cooling. So it turns out in the Antarctic lower stratosphere, there has been a cooling of several degrees over this time period. So a very large cooling. And connected with that cooling, based on observations but also modeling, is that as you cool the lower stratosphere, you end up changing the latitudinal temperature gradient, and that results in a shift of the westerly winds. The precipitation zones move with that, because as you move the winds, you actually move the storm tracks, so that moves where the precipitation is. And there's also evidence that the circulation, the Hadley, or the subtropical circulation, has also moved poleward with a shift in the precipitation. This response of the fact that when you introduce some cooling, you get this kind of poleward shift of the tropospheric circulation in summer is a very robust result. In models, there's lots of different models have done this, and even in the data you see this. The mechanism is a lot more uncertain, and there's probably 5 mechanisms out there that claim to have the mechanism, but we can't isolate which of them is right or what's happening or how much of them all is. So it's the mechanism, I think, strongly involves feedbacks within the tropospheric circulation, and so being able to isolate a single mechanism is proving to be difficult, if not impossible. So there's still research to be done on what's causing this, but there is a pretty robust result, at least those of us who come in the stratospheric ozone camp. So unfortunately, only some of the models had an ozone-only run, and this is what's shown here with the blue. Again, back to the black is when there's all forcing. And so there were these 2 studies, which I was a co-author of both of them, and so we come out saying ozone's the dominant driver. But there were 2 other studies where the ozone is not significant, and so it's not the main driver. So this is when we run into why are these studies coming up with inconsistent results. And they use different models as well, and so you could think that it was a different modeling result. And so, but it turns out that one of the differences between them is the ozone that they used. This study used a version of the NCAR model, which was used for CMIP5, where they didn't follow, they used their own ozone. And it turns out the stratospheric ozone depletion they put in was like 50% of the observed. And so there was they'd used their ozone from their own chemistry climate model, which had a bias in it, and that meant that their ozone depletion was much less. So it's perhaps not surprising they get a smaller signal. They also used a different time period, which I'll come back to. This study used the observed ozone, but the problem is that, so if I took a poll of people of when the ozone hole formed, I guess large percentage you probably wouldn't know, but the ones who would take a guess, I think the answer would be 1980. Okay. But if you actually look at the ozone data record, so this is ozone over Antarctica in September. The red dots are measurements that were made from Hadley Bay, which is the British station. They were making measurements from 1957, and they reported in 85 is when their paper came out about the ozone hole. So they reported the steady decline, or this rapid decline down here. The green dots and blue dots are from satellite measurements. This got reported. NASA was already looking at this data. They came out pretty quickly to say, yes, we also see that in satellite data. And so this is when it formed. But where does 1980 come from? It comes from this kind of somewhat arbitrary choice that they used to define the ozone hole that happened to coincide when they had their satellite data. And so there's metrics out there for the size of the ozone hole, which is the area, and it goes to 0 because they chose 200 Dobson units. So when you do the area of 200 Dobson average, that kind of goes to 0 around here. That's purely kind of arbitrary. If you look at this data, you can see that there's been significant, maybe even 50% of, or a third of the total depletion occurred before 1980. This fact is well known for those who worry about the stratospheric ozone, but outside that community, most people would phrase it with this, because that's when 1979 is when there was maps they could first make, and so you define 0 then. So it turns out that the modeling study had used this amount of ozone depletion instead of that. And they did this, they assumed that this value was the pre-industrial value, so they ran comparing the change in SSTs from 1870 to present day, and compared that with the ozone change just from 1980 onwards. So again, it wasn't, they get a result here that it's not the SSTs are more important, partly because it wasn't an apples and oranges comparison. So again, but that still leaves this study here that I said their ozone was a bit depleted, but it still wasn't clear why they're so much smaller. It turns out another difference between these studies is the time period that was used. And the latter study extended to 2009, where a lot of the earlier studies stopped at around 2000. They stopped around 2000 partly because they were earlier studies where there was data availability, but also if you look at this, ozone went down, Montreal Protocol has kicked in, CFCs are now stabilized, so ozone's gone down. In the last 10, 15 years, ozone's been bouncing around, but it's been a roughly constant region. So you might expect different trends over this period, over the whole period. So we took a run from a Goddard-based model, which had interactive chemistry. We did an ensemble of runs where SSTs and CF, this is ozone depleting substances. So when CFCs also varied, so SSTs and ozone vary in this run, and we compared it to runs where the CFCs were fixed. And we had the data so we could do the analysis from 1980 to 2000 or 1980 to 2009. And this is the time series averaged over these ensembles. So the black curve is the all forcing, and you see that it has a trend, basically a trend over the whole period. And if you calculate the trend from the first 20 years or the whole 30 years, you get similar results. The red curve is when it's only SSTs varying, and you see there's very little change over the first 20 years, but then there has been a dip over the last 10 years. So the trend you get is either 0 for the first 20 years or a trend of 0.2 if you choose the whole period. So this is indicating that SSTs have contributed over the latter part of the time record, partly because the SSTs have, the characteristics of them have changed, and also because ozone was decreasing here and it's been roughly constant. So it's actually switched from ozone dominated to more SST dominated. And that change is related to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So there's been a change in the SSTs. Well, my box has moved a little bit. So let's see if I'm showing here. So this is the trend. Sorry, that red box should be in a different location. So this is the trend from 1980 to 1999 in the SSTs. This is over the whole period. And then this is just the last kind of 92 to 2009. So this was this change in the characteristic of the SSTs because of what's now known as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. This is the correlation between the SSTs and the Hadley Cell edge over the whole run. And so this change in SSTs projects very strongly onto the Hadley Cell. And so it's this change in SSTs in the tropics has contributed to the expansion or the movement in the last kind of 10 years. Okay. So I would still argue that ozone is a dominant driver, especially over the period when it was changing dramatically. But since 2000, SSTs have contributed more, partly because there's been this change in SSTs and partly because ozone hasn't changed much. Okay, final topic which actually came up out of doing that analysis is this issue of kind of internal variability. And let me just cut to the results. So we were actually, when we looked at these individual runs, so these are runs, this is the trend in the Hadley Cell edge for 10 different runs that have SSTs changing, greenhouse gases changing, ozone changing, but in each run the same SSTs are prescribed, the same greenhouse gases, the ozone change is basically the same. And we get the mean, which is the result I showed before. The mean shift was around, say, 0.3. But we get ensemble members, there's 2 of the 10 where they actually get a contraction of the edge. And then we get, 2 of them which have a very large expansion. So there's this large variability in these runs, which is only due to internal atmospheric variability. The aerosols are fixed, SSTs are fixed, greenhouse gases are fixed, ozone is fixed. This is what you get for a 20-year trend this is the kind of variability that you can get. And then you compare that with the reanalyses. So again, this is the result that the mean of the model gets a trend that's down here, which is basically less than all the reanalyses. So it's something. So one conclusion is this: is the model is underestimating the trend. However, another explanation could be is that, well, hang on, some of these model runs are getting a result which is very consistent with the reanalyses. And so it could be not a problem with the model per se, but it's a problem that the observations are showing a forced response. So the mean, this is the forced response of the model, and then this is some natural variability. So it could be, and I don't know how to prove this, but my conjecture is that what we've been observing is a forced response plus some natural variability that happened to be of the same sign as the forced response. And this actually applies, that was the southern hemisphere. It applies in the northern hemisphere as well. So in the northern hemisphere you get, very small trends in the mean, but then individual ensemble members can get values that are, as large or larger than the reanalysis, but it can also get contractions. So this is 20-year trends, this is 30-year trends. So another take-home message is that 30-year is too short to be saying you're getting just a forced response, and the model is indicating you can get lots of variability. Okay. And you might argue that this was the model that we used here was from Goddard. It was just one model, but if you go and look at some of these other ensemble runs, like the done with CAM3 or the large ensemble, the blue is the model I just showed, the black is the NCAR model, and this is a measure of the variability. And so they're showing very similar kind of internal variability. So it seems that once you see this distribution, you can understand that there's a chance you can get much larger trends or much smaller. So you can explain using a model the observed change in the Hadley Cell in the southern hemisphere using the observed SSTs, realistic ozone depletion, and a large enough ensemble to account for natural variability. So if you do this, there is no model data inconsistency. Okay. So overall conclusions are that some of the metrics that have been used to quote the expansion are measuring something different than the Hadley Cell or surface dryness. So those metrics still could be useful. We just shouldn't be comparing them to these other quantities. Ozone has been a dominant driver of the trends in the southern hemisphere during summer, especially over the period when the ozone was changing rapidly. Since then, SSTs have contributed more, and there's indications, or at least speculation, that the observed trends include a large fraction of internal variability. And it's not necessarily SST related variability, it could be internal atmospheric variability. So even accounting for the change in SSTs doesn't account for it all. Okay, so what are some of the outstanding issues? And one of them is the fact that everything I've shown you is zonal mean. And we'd worry, because the Hadley Cell is this zonal mean perspective, but if you're worried about surface precipitation, surface dryness, then you have to worry about zonal kind of activity variations. And so this is a somewhat recent paper that's looked at using the sea level pressure as a metric. So that's what's shown in green is the climatology, and in the red is the trends. And so you see the high pressures here, and so they're using the subtropical high as their metric of the edge, which is shown in green, and then they're seeing in the zonal mean, they see a poleward movement, which is what the red curve's showing. But you can see that in some basins, there's been an increase in the surface pressure, so a poleward movement here. Other ones, it's more likely a shift. And that's what they've kind of quantified here in terms of, for the different longitudes, what's the the shift. So, but this is something that we've been talking with Sultan. I think the centers of action approach will be a good thing to quantify how these high pressures have been changing, and then relating that to precipitation changes. It's a strange spelling, but so I don't know how. It'd be nice to try and approach to figure out how much of these variations are actually due to natural versus forced, and we need to know that to know whether the models are getting it right and what's happening in the future, and what's happening with some of these upper atmospheric kind of metrics. Anyhow, okay, thank you.
So we have time for some questions.
So I'm a oceanographer, and my bias for atmospheric persistence is ever, I've always been told that the atmosphere loses its memory of its initial state over a couple of years. What in the atmosphere has a 20-year time scale?
Well, I'm not sure it's persistent. I just think it's a chaotic kind of system. So you can take, a very idealized model that just has our solving of the dynamical equations, and you can run those, and you will get, just through the variability, I don't know the cause of it, but you do get these 20 to 30 year trends. So this is not, it's not a surprise, but it seems that it's not a surprise, but then you can quite often forget to take it into account. So I think there's just enough kind of,
Something is remote.
yeah.
Something is so
Yeah.
Marat, you raised your hand.
Yeah, just the question of resolution of those models that you didn't mention. I know that the analysis products, they have resolution of 1 degree, not resolution grid spacing of
Right.
1 degree. Effective resolution is about 6 degrees. So, and you're talking about like 0.2 degree shift.
Yes.
Using a model that resolves on a 6 degree signal.
Yeah, yeah. So the models I'm using are all they've got resolution maybe 2 degrees. So we're looking at
Grid spacing, it's not resolution.
right. So yes. So you're looking at small shift over a time period, and then so when it comes to identifying these metrics, you've got to do interpolation. If you're trying to find where the latitude where it crosses 0 or where something's the peak, you've got to do a fit. So yes. So we're looking at a small number within the model's resolution isn't really capable for doing that. So that's certainly a concern. And in fact, these are small numbers.
You showed that the SST contribution to Hadley Cell expansion is large since 1990, and you showed the negative PTO phase. So how can you relate with this negative PTO phase with Hadley Cell expansion? Is it because the wormhole gets warmer?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to explain. I'm just going to show. So if you took, this is a model result. So the bottom plot here is saying if you take if you correlate where the Hadley cell edge with the SSTs and the variability in that just from the long runs, you get a pattern like this saying that the Hadley cell edge is, I guess this is a poleward expansion when it's warm here and it's cool either side. So this is from the model, this is saying this SST pattern projects or is correlated with the expansion of the Hadley cell. And it turns out that this pattern is very similar to the PDO kind of pattern. So it's something connected with this warming and cooling. The mechanism, exactly how that works, I don't know.
Yeah, just a comment on Heidi's question is that it's kind of similar to the Enso jet relationship when you have increased tropical heating. I think one of the mechanisms would be when you have increased tropical heating, you get an accelerated subtropical jet, which actually, because the jet position is sort of a compromise between the accelerated to the Hadley circulation and the eddy feedback, which actually bring it forward. So when you have stronger Hadley cell forcing, then it sort of attracts the jet equatorward. So when you have ENSO, when you have El Nino, actually the jet is shifted equatorward. So similar with PDO, when you have positive PDO, it shifts the jet equatorward. So you have negative PDO, they shift forward. But I'm actually surprised that at the end of your, that's my question now. So I'm surprised at the end you didn't actually mention the mechanism that actually link the forward shift of the jet. Because actually after more than 10 years of study, we are, as you said, we are left with more than 5 or even more mechanisms that claim to be able to understand or explain the jet. But what do you think about the most recent claim that it's actually mostly due, or at least the global warming part is mostly due to cloud feedback? Because I think they removed the cloud change from at least one model run, and then they couldn't see the.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not. I don't. We have to talk. I don't know. Yeah. I don't have an answer. That's why I didn't mention it, because it's and a lot of people have looked at it. So this is in terms of Hadley Cell, but the same question goes about the mid-latitude jet. And that's a very robust kind of result, even stronger than this. And so once the jet moves, I think the Hadley Cell edge is moving with that. So I think once the coupling between there we can understand, but it's why the jet moves with ozone, and I don't know. And I've had postdocs working on this who are smarter than me in terms of the dynamics, and other people, and there's no kind of consensus. And it's partly because everything's so coupled together. So it's not clear. You think you've got a model, I should be able to tease everything apart. But the feedback seemed to be so strong that it seems like lots of different things could just seem to tickle the system and it moves. And clouds could be another one, I don't know. Yeah, it's frustrating.
So, yes, Malcolm.
Let's assume that forward expansion of the Hadley Cell was, say, 0.5 degree a decade. That's like 3 miles a year. So it doesn't sound like very much. And so where does that concern fit on the spectrum from? I mean, obviously climate deniers. Where down the hierarchy do you start saying, well, this could be important?
Yeah, so I think that's an area where I think so the potential is, you could at least think, I can't think of a good example, you could think of places where, they're on the case where they kind of water, 0.3 is not very far, but if you're a place that means that you're getting much less water because you've moved into that regime, that's where it would be important. So it would be people where you're living on the edge of where it is at the moment, or maybe just outside it. And unfortunately, a lot of those are places where they're already water stressed, or there's not much resources there.
So people don't really have mobility to move.
Yeah. So this is a lot of
So what
Africa.
is mentioned is that if the Sahel expands northward into southern Europe, so that would be a major economic impact. So that in the IPCC report, that particular scenario is mentioned.
But that's where I think we've got to move from the zonal perspective to looking to it regionally to see where it's coming. And so I've been to a couple of these meetings where it was meant to be discussion of the impacts, and we spent all the time in the science, and when it got to the impacts there was lots of speculation, but to be honest it was pretty hard to find an evidence of that happening now.
Okay, just a reminder that from 1:30 to 2 p.m. in room 113, Professor Waugh will be speaking to graduate students. So please